Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to Conversations at Noon at Connecticut's Old State House. My name is Mariana Garcia, and I'm the Public Programs Manager here at Connecticut's Old State House. And I want to thank you all for tuning in and joining us today for Ins and Outs of Ranked Choice Voting. Today's program will focus on this alternative system of voting, ranked choice voting, or RCV, also known as instant runoff voting. And here to talk to us about ranked choice voting is our guest speaker, Dr. Joseph Coll from Sewanee, the University of the South. But before we bring Dr. Coll over, just a quick overview of what ranked choice voting is. So this is, as I said, an alternative form of voting, which has in the last couple of years been discussed more and more in different legislatures all over the nation, including here in Connecticut. In fact, this session, there were 4 different bills brought to committee to be discussed for introducing ranked choice voting here in Connecticut, both in the municipality local level and also more in the state level. So even though these bills have not passed committee, so they will not be hitting the Senate and House floor this session, we might be hearing from them again in the future. So we do need to know and understand what ranked choice voting is and how it's being used in other elections throughout the country. So here is Dr. Joseph Coll. So Dr. Joseph Coll is a visiting assistant professor of politics at Sewanee, the University of the South, where he will be teaching courses in American government and politics, campaign and elections, conducting political science research, political behavior, and racial and ethnic politics. He received his PhD in political science from the University of Iowa, where his dissertation focused on how election administration and access affect the voter turnout rates of Black, Latino, white, and young Americans. His current research agenda examines how elections administration and access affect political opinions and behavior, and how those changes to political opinion and behavior go on to affect public policy, with a particular eye towards radical ethnic and racial, ethnic, and age groups. So, Dr. Joseph Coll, thank you so much for joining us today. You have the floor.
Thank you for having me. So, as Mariana said, my name is Joseph Coll. I'm a visiting assistant professor at Sewanee, the University of the South. I want to thank you all for tuning into this live stream, as well as thank Connecticut Old State House for having me here for this discussion. So as mentioned today, we're talking about the ins and outs of ranked choice voting. We have a couple different things I'm going to be focusing on. First, what is ranked choice voting? How ranked choice voting works? Who uses it? The pros and cons, and the role of election officials in helping voters with ranked choice voting. So first, what is ranked choice voting? I'm sure many of you are aware, the United States operates under what's called plurality and majority rules. In elections, voters typically vote for a single candidate. You get one choice to vote between 2 candidates. In plurality elections, whichever candidate wins the most votes, even if it's less than 50%, they're the candidate who wins the election. In majority elections, the candidate has to get 50% of the vote in order to win. If you're in a majority election and no candidate gets 50% of the vote, then you hold another election at a later date that's called a runoff election. We've had a couple high-profile runoff elections, for example, in Georgia these last couple years. Now, ranked choice voting, it acts as an alternative to this system. Instead of having you just vote for a single candidate, instead, ranked choice voting, RCV, it allows voters to rank their candidates in order of preference from most to least preferred. Second, like majority elections, it requires that a candidate receive 50% of the vote in order to win. So you have to have a majority favorability in order to win the election. But unlike majority elections, it does not require a second election be held later on, a second runoff election, if no candidate gets 50% of the vote in the first round. So how does ranked choice voting work? Well, as I mentioned, ranked choice voting, it allows candidates to voters to rank candidates in order of preference. So I have this sample ballot over here on the right. It has a bunch of different candidates from a demonstration ballot in Alaska in 2021, Let's say hypothetically, I wanted Naomi Jackson to be my first candidate. I'd fill in the first bubble with Naomi Jackson. Say I wanted Heather Olsen as my second candidate, I would then fill in that second place bubble. Chick Hicks as my third favorite candidate, I'd fill in that third place bubble. Now, at the end of the first round of voting, we tabulate votes and see if any candidate has more than 50% of the vote. If they do, they win, election's over. However, if no candidate has 50% of the vote, the least popular candidate is eliminated. Everybody who voted for that candidate first, they have their vote transferred from their first favorite candidate to the second favorite candidate. Now, this continues until somebody has 50% of the vote. For example, if I wanted Naomi Jackson first, but Naomi Jackson was the least favored candidate, Naomi Jackson would be eliminated, and my vote would then go to the second choice candidate. So I have this link here. I don't know if it won't work with this presentation. I apologize. But if you follow this link, you can actually see how Alaska's ranked choice voting election ended up unfolding in 2022. You see how Lisa Murkowski, although she did not get a majority in the first election, after the last two candidates are eliminated, she ends up getting a majority of this election and winning the election. So who uses ranked choice voting? Well, in the United States, we have two states that use ranked choice voting for the general election, Alaska and Maine. We also have several states that use ranked choice voting for overseas ballots. This includes 6 states down there in the deep south, Alabama, Georgia, around this area. There are also 2 counties that use ranked choice voting, as well as 60 cities. Now, cities is where ranked choice voting tends to be the most popular. A lot of cities have been making these changes in recent years. This kind of reflects this idea of localities and states as this like laboratory of democracy, where these smaller areas, these cities, these counties, they can experiment with changes like ranked choice voting to see if it solves some of the problems that we're currently seeing in our system. Now, ranked choice voting is also kind of popular abroad. For example, it's been used in Australia for quite a while. And a lot of the information we have for how ranked choice voting works actually comes out of Australia. It's also used in Ireland and Malta, as well as the Scottish and Welsh parliaments in the UK, or at least variants thereof. For the potential benefits of ranked choice voting. Well, first, it requires a majority of voters to win, very similar to how majority elections work. In order to be the winner of the election, you have to have the most votes. Second, it allows voters to vote for who they prefer instead of who they think has the best chance of winning. Imagine we have 3 candidates, candidate A, B, and C. Candidate A is the one you like the most. You like B somewhat, and you really dislike C. Ranked choice voting allows you to vote for A if you really like that candidate. And if any candidate doesn't get a 50% of the vote, then that least favorite candidate is eliminated. Votes are then reshuffled, and you have a chance to keep your first preferred candidate in the election. At the same exact time, if you voted for A first and you voted for B second, and anybody gets a majority of the vote, it doesn't matter who you would have voted for, A or B, this other candidate would have won all of this. So it allows you to really put your sincere preference forward. Another benefit of ranked choice voting is what's called Condorcet candidates. Now, Condorcet candidates is when the winner of the election would have won in a head-to-head match against any other candidate. So again, if we have our hypothetical lineup of candidates A, B, and C, a Condorcet candidate would be candidate A if they beat candidate B, and candidate A beating candidate C. Therefore, they're the most popular candidate. Ranked choice voting argues that because of this issue of allowing you to rank by preference instead of choosing the lesser of 2 evils, it ends up selecting the candidate that's more preferred than candidates that are least preferred. Another major benefit is that it can be potentially cheaper than having majority elections with runoffs, specifically because you don't need to have a runoff election anymore. In RCV elections, you automatically reshuffle ballots if nobody gets 50% of the vote, so you don't need to have a second election months later. In these second elections, these runoff elections can be very costly. You have to pay poll worker supervisors, you have to lease locations, print new ballots, and things along those lines. So you might be able to save some money by not having to have this runoff election in the future. Another positive is that it can increase candidate civility and decrease negative campaigning. So we know that American politics, we typically have this perception of them being very negative, very angry, things along those lines. However, in RCV elections, candidates have an incentive to not be negative. For example, imagine that I and Mariana were both running for election, as well as 6 other candidates. Because voters can rank Mariana first and me second, I have an incentive to be nice to Mariana, so I don't want to insult her or her base. That way I get those second place votes. I know they really want Mariana to be elected, but if Mariana is eliminated, I want her voters to come to me. And so because of that, I'll spend less time being negative on the campaign trail. Another potential benefit is that ranked choice voting may result in electing more underrepresented candidates. This goes back to the idea of you can vote for who you prefer instead of who you think is going to win. The last kind of potential benefit of RCV is increasing voter turnout. This relates back to this increased civility because we know that, again, American elections tend to be pretty negative. Some people might not want to vote because they don't want to participate in a negative system. However, if you do away with some of that negativity, people might be more willing to cast a ballot. At the same time, it may increase turnout because candidates try to reach out to more voters. Again, I want to have Mariana's voters list me second, and so I'm not just, mobilizing my own voters, I'm mobilizing other candidates' voters to rank me second or third or so on. So these are all potential benefits of ranked choice voting, but there are also some potential drawbacks. So Mariana, we have a slight issue here where this picture should have appeared differently. Is there a way to fix that? Can I just share my screen?
Yeah.
Better.
Let's see. Apologies for the issue. Let's see.
Sorry about that. Where is it? Window. There we go. Share. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Awesome. All right. Animations, what are you going to do? So the first kind of potential drawback of ranked choice voting is that it might be more difficult for voters to rank candidates. So if we have this ranked choice voting ballot, this demonstration ballot that we saw earlier, if I again wanted Naomi Jackson as my first candidate, I fill in that bubble. And then if I want Chick Hicks as my second candidate, but I accidentally fill in the same bubble on the first choice row, this can result in my ballot actually being invalidated. It can be thrown out because I improperly fill it out. Now, ranked choice voting ballots, they're more difficult than our plurality or majority ballots. So you might see more of these issues pop up when you vote. And further, not only do these difficulties exist, but some evidence suggests that these difficulties may be worse for those who already have a harder time voting, for example, those with lower education rates. With that said, there is some evidence to suggest this may change with experience. When you first adopt a new voting rule, it might be kind of some hiccups at the beginning, but as you go through an election or two, people start to adapt and figure out how to traverse this system. So another issue is that requires voters become informed about multiple candidates. Because you are listing multiple candidates on your ballot, you might want to have a little bit of information about each candidate. This requires a lot of difficulty on the voters' point because they have to then become informed about candidates 1 through 5 or whatever their preferences are. Now, with that being said, you actually don't have to rank more than one candidate. You can vote for a single candidate if you like. Say you don't like any other candidates, you can stop at 1 or however many you want. I also mentioned earlier that RCV can save some money by not requiring runoff elections. At the same time, there could be some pretty high startup costs of ranked choice voting. For example, you might have to print off new ballots, get new ballot tallying machines, new equipment, and things along those lines. So in this sense, ranked choice voting, it's very much of an upfront investment that has the potential to pay off over time by the elimination of those runoff elections. Last, kind of the biggest claim against ranked choice voting is this idea of ballot exhaustion. Now, ballot exhaustion occurs when you've ranked all the candidates you're allowed to rank. Say there's 10 candidates on the field, they let you rank 5, you rank all 5 of those, but all 5 of your candidates get eliminated before the final round. This means that in the final round of voting, your vote basically no longer is influencing the election. That's ballot exhaustion. Now, when you have ballot exhaustion, it can result in having an unfavored winner or a winner who would not have won in every head-to-head match. For example, as we saw earlier, candidate A beat candidate B and candidate C. You can have it to where candidate A would beat candidate B, but not candidate C, but candidate A still wins because of that ballot exhaustion issue. So I asked, how can election officials help with ranked choice voting? The biggest thing that election officials can do is provide education to voters to try to reduce some of the negative effects of ranked choice voting. So first, provide sample ballots online. If you institute ranked choice voting at the county level, have sample ballots on the county clerk's website. Or if you do it at the local level, same exact thing. Anywhere where voters go to understand if they're registered, where the polling places are, get voter information, if you provide sample ballots, this will really help individuals become familiar with the voting process. We also send out informational pamphlets ahead of time so voters can see how ranked choice voting works and how their ballots look so they get familiar with it. And of course, you can try training poll workers to be more familiar with ranked choice voting, make sure that they can assist voters who have questions. Poll workers really are the street level bureaucrats of elections. And if a voter has an issue, that's who they go to. So it's important that poll workers understand how to use these ranked choice voting ballots so they can assist their voters. Anyways, that's all that I've got for you today. I have some additional sources here if you want to dive more into ranked choice voting. I want to point out this one article called What We Know About Ranked Choice Voting. If you are about to vote on ranked choice voting, you want to know more about it, you're an election official, I highly suggest checking out this resource. It covers a lot of the emerging literature on ranked choice voting in recent years. Anyways, thank you for your time. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to shoot me an email, follow me on Twitter, get all the election updates.
Thank you so much, Joseph. That was a really, really good, quick summary of what ranked choice voting is. And now that we have time to go a bit more in depth into what ranked choice voting is, maybe we can start with going over where ranked choice voting, the idea for ranked choice voting came from, and how did it start being implemented here in the United States or in other countries as well, as you mentioned.
Yeah, so ranked choice voting, we have some evidence that ranked choice voting, at least the idea of it, kind of really started to surface as early as the 13th century. But it wasn't until about the 19th or 20th century that ranked choice voting style elections really became widespread and started to become empirically examined, mostly abroad. But there has been some adoption in the United States. Some states, localities, and cities have adopted ranked choice voting and then repealed it, or they've adopted and kept it on. But for the most part, it's not too popular in the U.S. yet.
Mm. All right. And so how has ranked choice voting started to be implemented in other states? And have their voter turnout increased at all with ranked choice voting? What has been the effect?
Yeah, so it's very difficult to assess how well ranked choice voting has worked elsewhere, particularly in regards to turnout effects, because ranked choice voting is used predominantly in low turnout municipal elections. And so it's really hard to gauge the effect it's having if you usually don't have a lot of people turn out anyways. And further, a lot of these elections are also nonpartisan, which makes it difficult to compare these elections to, say, a federal election or a general election.
Mm-hmm.
But with that being said, some work does suggest that replacing, for example, the primary system and the runoff system with ranked choice voting could increase turnout. But it's unclear whether or not this increase was due to changes in election timing versus ranked choice voting in and of itself. Some of my own work suggests that there's some evidence, very preliminary, to suggest that ranked choice voting can increase youth voter turnout, but more work needs to be done in this area to really examine it. A big issue is that ranked choice voting has not been in the United States for all that long, and not a lot of places have it. And so it makes it difficult to really tease out the effects of ranked choice voting.
Right. And what do you know what is the largest election that has used ranked choice voting to date?
Ooh, that's a good question. There's a number of large cities in California, and then as well as like Minneapolis and Minnesota that use ranked choice voting. San Francisco, I know, has RCV, and a couple of the California cities are probably the largest. There's also Alaska had a primary. Maine, I think, used it just recently in the 2020 election. So those are probably some of the largest that we've been seeing.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so one of the big criticisms, as you mentioned, of ranked choice voting is that it's a lot harder, and people will have difficulty using the ballot correctly, and that some people will just decide not to turn out to vote at all because they just don't understand it or are intimidated by the new system. So in your research, what voters, first of all, is this true? Have people found this more difficult than regular voting? And what demographics tend to find it more difficult?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And this argument of RCV being much more difficult than plurality or majority elections is a crucial underpinning of the opponents of RCV's arguments. There is some evidence to suggest that people do find ranked choice voting more difficult, but it's not by large margins. If I remember correctly, a recent study showed that like 80 to 90% of voters found ranked choice voting to be somewhat or very easy compared to about 90 to 95% of plurality voters. So there is a gap between how difficult ranked choice voting is compared to plurality and majority elections, but those gaps aren't too large. When it comes to who finds it difficult, earlier research used to suggest that it was lower income, lower educated, non-white, older, and female voters all had more difficult times using ranked choice voting. And the evidence for this usually came from looking at who exhausted their ballots or who didn't fill in all the ballot options or things along those lines. They really used ballots as the metric to examine whether or not people were having difficulties. However, newer researchers use survey questions. We ask people, rank these candidates. How hard was it for you to rank those candidates? And this evidence suggests that older and less educated people do find ranked choice voting more difficult, but we're not seeing differences in gender, race, or ethnicity as we previously predicted. So we need some more research to exactly understand who finds it difficult. But I think by and large, most research suggests it's a little bit more difficult than is plurality voting.
Thank you. So we have a comment from Giselle who is asking that same question, whether is there any documentation that any voters are having difficulty with understanding the ballot within the minority and elderly community? So, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a couple different studies, and I think I cite a couple of them at the end of that PowerPoint that do suggest that minority communities might have a more difficult time using the RCV ballots. There's some evidence from early San Francisco RCV elections that suggested that minority candidates, if I remember correctly, were less likely to use all of their rankings and maybe more likely to make errors on their ballot, as well as the elderly community. My own work, I used a sample in 2020, a survey sample, and I found that minority voters are not more or less likely to make any errors on their ballots than our non-minority voters, but older individuals are. And so there is some evidence that older individuals might be the core group that might be hindered by this voting system more often than other groups. And part of this, again, might go back to the experience issue, that if you're older voter, you've probably been voting for a while, you've been voting under the similar system for a while, and so you kind of gotten ingrained in your way of voting. Whereas when that system is shocked by a new reform, it makes it a little bit more difficult to overcome that than, say, a younger voter who has not had this loyalty or this experience to a particular system.
That's interesting. And going back to younger voters, you mentioned that ranked choice voting might actually help encourage younger voters to turn out to vote. Could you go a little bit more into detail on that?
Yeah, so there's not been a lot of systematic evidence examining whether or not young voters actually are more likely to vote under ranked choice voting. I and my colleague Courtney Julick at the University of Wisconsin-Stout, we had done a study to examine whether or not RCV increases youth voting. And like all studies, there are issues with it. And so this is nowhere near the final word in the question of whether or not RCV increases turnout. But we hypothesized that two reasons why ranked choice voting would increase turnout for youth. First, young individuals, this latest generation, they grew up in an era of hyper-partisanship, hyper-negative partisanship. And so they're especially turned off by this negative partisanship, this negative elections, negative campaigning. And so in ranked choice voting, when it incentivizes individuals to be nicer to each other, it might result in younger individuals being more likely to vote because they're not seeing that negative aspect. Second, younger voters, they lack information about how to vote. They're less knowledgeable about politics. They're less engaged with politics and things along those lines. And so they're really reliant on campaign mobilization. Young individuals are much more likely to vote if somebody asks them to vote, particularly campaigns. And as I mentioned, under ranked choice voting, candidates have an incentive to reach out to more voters beyond just their typical base to try to shore up second and third place votes. And so under ranked choice voting, you might have more individuals reaching out to young individuals to try to get them to vote. We did this study examining whether or not negativity or mobilization affects youth voter turnout in RCV versus plurality elections. And we find that RCV elections do have higher youth turnout, and a large artifact of this is because of increased mobilization. Now, again, more work needs to be done in this area to examine the robustness of the study and try to extrapolate it to other areas. We had, I think, like 12 or 13 RCV cities we're examining. It's important to understand whether or not this is an anomaly of those areas of that study, or if this is more of a widespread phenomenon. Very good question, though. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. All right. So focusing more about that outreach. So, what have other states done in order to educate the voters and how to use this new system of voting? And how has it worked out?
Yeah, so a frequent education effort is just typically ads. This could be TV ads, radio ads, putting ads in print, on billboards, on buses, just anywhere we can get information out to the voters is a frequent tool of election officials to educate them. You'll tell them about how to use ranked choice voting, what it means, what it does, how it works. And that can help not only educate citizens on how this system works, but increase their trust in this system if they understand how it works. Now, as I mentioned, an easier and particularly cheaper option is to include this information on election websites. When individuals go to check whether or not they're registered, have a link right below the Are You Registered link that says, check out an RCV ballot. Let citizens examine this ballot and maybe even like pretend to fill it out or something along those lines so they get some practice with this system before they go into it. There's also potentially spending money on pamphlets and sending those to candidate or to voters, showing here's what an RCV ballot looks like. Here's how you fill it out. Here's what you do if you fill it out wrong. Here's who you talk to, things along those lines to really make sure that citizens understand how these ballots work and what to do if something goes wrong.
Right, thank you. So these are all things that should be happening even without the ranked choice voting, but
Yes.
definitely more when there's this brand new system. So another criticism that has been brought up against ranked choice voting is that it's just going to cost so much to make all the changes that would need to be done in order to change all of the ballots, all of the systems. Could you talk on that? Would it really cost more, or would it be in the long run a bit more cost efficient?
Yeah, and so again, this is one of those questions that it's difficult to answer at this point in time because we just have a lack of information on this. We don't have a whole lot of localities that have instituted RCV to examine costs prior and after. What research does exist is kind of mixed because, as I mentioned earlier, you have these two competing costs. First is just the upstart cost of ranked choice voting. This is, printing new ballots, getting new machines, new tabulations, training poll workers, all of that. There's also long-term savings of no longer having runoff elections. So if you're a city that uses majority voting and you have frequent runoff elections, RCV may save you some money in the long run, though you're going to have to put up some upfront costs to really solidify those changes. So I saw a study that was examining New York, for example, and New York City estimated it cost about $100,000 to $500,000 to implement ranked choice voting, or it'd save about $20 million per year. And over the long run, that's a good bit of savings. It's just New York City. It's not necessarily applicable to everywhere else, but that was just one data point we can use to leverage. In the end, it's possible that RCV will save some money, but it's also possible these upfront costs may be pretty hefty.
Thank you. And so states that adopt ranked choice voting as a new system, what have they had to buy, like new equipment, new scanners, new voting, obviously new voting ballots, but what other like technologies and equipment would have to be replaced?
Yeah, so that depends on the equipment that's currently used and what you can salvage versus what you need to buy new. It's possible and likely you'll need to buy some new equipment. For example, if your current ballot printing machines cannot print RCV ballots, as well as new equipment to count these ballots. Counting ranked choice voting ballots is a little bit more difficult than plurality and majority ballots because of how this system works of your first choice goes to your second choice, your first choice eliminated, and all of that. You might also have to, for example, purchase the algorithm that counts those things. But there are a lot of resources out there for offsetting some of those costs and offsetting some of those the equipment costs and the software costs for getting that done. But there's a good chance you might need to buy some new equipment. Again, it's going to vary depending on what equipment you already have.
Right. Thank you. And so going a bit more into the practice itself of using ranked choice voting during elections. So will voters be able to just vote for one candidate as they usually do in plurality voting, or are they required to fill the whole ballot with their ranking?
Yeah, so under ranked choice voting, just like majority and plurality systems, you can vote for just a single candidate if you'd like. You can go in there and fill in one bubble, count it good, and leave, and that's absolutely not an issue. The flip side of that is that oftentimes what they'll do is limit the number of candidates you can vote for. So, for example, if there are 15 candidates that's running for some office, the ranked choice voting ballot might say you can only vote for your favorite 5 or something like that. So there's usually not a floor for the number you can vote for, just you have to vote for one. But there's usually a ceiling of you cannot vote for any more than 5 or 10 or whatever that city uses.
Thank you. And so you did mention the times where you have inactive or exhausted ballots. Could you go a little bit more into detail on that? How does that work and how does that happen?
Yeah. So again, exhausted ballots and active ballots, they are one of the main criticisms levied against RCV. And so an exhausted ballot, as I mentioned earlier, is what happens when you have ranked, say there's 10 candidates in the field, you ranked 5 of those candidates, all 5 of your choices have been eliminated. That means that there's still 5 candidates going, the election is still going on, but because you didn't rank any of the 5 candidates that are currently running in the election that have not been eliminated, your vote basically isn't counting anymore towards this final election. Now, there are some issues with this because if you wanted to participate in this election, you ranked all 5, but your vote is no longer counting for this end goal, this majority election there at the end, you're not influencing this outcome. Further, it can create a system where candidates are actually elected, then they're receiving a majority of the vote in the last round of voting, but not a majority of those votes cast. So imagine that a lot of people had their ballots exhausted, then that results in the last voter or last candidate, they get a majority of the votes in that last round, but because so many voters were exhausted, they actually would not receive a majority of all of the votes cast in that election.
Interesting. Thank you. So, how would be these ballots counted? I'm assuming there's going to be a whole different system in order to count the ranks, and then start over if with the last one that wasn't counted.
Yeah, so these are typically counted via like a software algorithm or things along those lines, where you'd insert all the ballots, and then the ranked choice voting algorithm would then calculate like, okay, well, this person was not or like there's nobody got a 50% threshold, nobody's a majority candidate, so eliminate the least popular one, recycle their votes, and the algorithm themselves will go ahead and calculate all of that for you, and they'd be able to get you the outcome of who would win that election. And so a lot of it, instead of like hand counting, which hand counting ranked choice voting ballots is possible, but very difficult. And so a lot of this does require a little bit more electronic software and things along those lines to get pretty quick results.
And how quick would that be? How long does it usually take to count ranked choice voting results?
Yeah, so this depends on a number of factors, including the competitiveness of the election. For example, if you had 10 candidates, but one candidate immediately is the most popular candidate, there's no competition, they're going to get 80% of the vote. That's pretty easy. There's also other issues such as the number of ballots, machine availability, and more, such that it's going to vary drastically depending on the locality. Now, Maine, they suggest it'll take about 1.5 to 2 weeks after the election to get a final count. But like modern elections, we can usually gauge a winner before then. What's important to understand is that even on election day here in the United States, I know we have this perception that we vote on that Tuesday, and by midnight that Tuesday, we know exactly who's going to be winning the election. But oftentimes it takes states weeks to finalize their actual vote counts. And so just like those regular elections, RCV will also take a little while to get that final count.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like every year it takes a little bit longer to get the final results during elections. All right, so let's see, I have so many questions here. So another criticism that has been brought against ranked choice voting is that it has the potential to raise a lot more questions of election integrity. So could this be true? Could you talk a little bit on this?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And election integrity is incredibly important in the United States and abroad to understand that citizens have to feel like the elections are being conducted fairly to have faith in the outcome of those elections. Now, anytime you change how elections are operated, you run the risk of people questioning the legitimacy of that election. Anytime you make a new system, any changes to how people vote, how they access elections, people might feel like there might be some mischievous things going on in the background. So the issue is not questioning of the integrity. Instead, the issue is how individuals respond to those questions. Because again, anytime you change how people access elections, people might have questions about why those changes were invoked. So what's important here is to make sure that election officials, elected officials, legislators, that they're being upfront about these changes and they're talking about how ranked choice voting works, the mechanisms behind it and all of that, so that when it comes time to vote, voters have an idea of how this system works. If you don't explain how ranked choice voting works, you just thrust it upon the people and they see ranked choice voting as this black box that they don't understand, they might not feel like the election was fair or legitimate. But if you go through and explain the processes to them and make them aware of how this works, that'll help offset some of those negative effects. And so it's all about implementing it and making sure that people understand how the system works to make sure you don't have some of this questioning of the legitimacy itself. Does that make sense?
Sorry. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we do have a couple of pre-submitted questions from our audience, and anybody who's watching us live right now, please do leave us your questions in the comments or in the chat. Let me take a quick look to see if we have any new questions. Not yet. So yeah, if you do have a question, please do let us know. Leave them in the chat. But let's see. One question is, in jurisdictions where ranked choice voting is being used, how have underrepresented candidates or third-party candidates benefited? And have they seen any increase in supports and wins?
This is a very good question. Again, one of the arguments in favor of ranked choice voting is that it could help elect more underrepresented candidates. And there is some evidence to suggest, though evidence is clearly mixed here, about whether or not ranked choice voting can help these underrepresented candidates. A number of studies have shown that ranked choice voting can increase the probability of winning for example, female candidates and candidates of color, while some other evidence suggests that it doesn't have this effect, but I haven't seen any evidence to suggest it negatively affects these groups. So as a whole, the evidence seems to suggest either there's no change in the probability of winning for underrepresented candidates, or it might increase the probability of winning, increase the chances that they get elected. And again, a lot of this goes back to the idea that you get to rank your candidates by preference instead of voting for the lesser of two evils or whoever you think has the best chance of winning. So some evidence does suggest it can help these candidates, but again, we need more evidence here. And simply, we need more places to try ranked choice voting for us to be able to understand whether or not it has any impact.
Great, thank you. And another question, does ranked choice voting make an individual's ballot more or less impactful?
That is a very good question. It's difficult to answer because of how we want to define impactful, but I would suggest that it probably doesn't change the impact too much unless your ballot gets exhausted. To the extent to which you have an exhausted ballot, that ballot is no longer impacting the election, but I don't think it increases the impactfulness in any discernible way as far as I'm aware.
All right. So would it be safe to say that maybe instead of being more or less impactful, it just changes the way that you decide to vote, right?
Yeah, the biggest changes RCV brings about is how citizens decide to put their votes down, how they decide to vote, and how candidates decide to run.
Mm-hmm. All right. So another question we have here, you already sort of address, how far down the list will we have to rank? For example, will we have to rank every candidate in the ballot or just pick our top two?
Yeah, as mentioned earlier, you can rank one candidate. I mean, you can rank just your favorite candidate, or you can rank all the candidates you're allowed to rank. It'll change by locality about the number you're allowed to rank. But again, the floor is always, if you're going to vote, you have to vote for at least one, but you can vote for just one and count that good. However, if you want to vote for all 5 or all 10, if your city allows you to do so, you can. But again, some localities, they say, even if there's 50 candidates, you can only vote for 5. So there's a ceiling, but there's not necessarily a floor, unless you want to count voting for a single candidate as the floor.
All right. So here's a question that's sort of similar to another one we already addressed. In your opinion, would this method of voting be more or less friendly to third-party candidates?
So evidence, and again, on that is a little bit mixed. I want to say it'd be a little bit more friendly based on some of the evidence I've seen recently, but again, it's still very much mixed. We have not come to a consensus in the political science community about the effects of ranked choice voting, at least here in the United States, because again, we haven't used it all that much, and it's only 60 cities are using RCV. It's really hard to extrapolate to generalize from those 60 cities to other areas. So at this point, we're really not sure, but I'm leaning towards it potentially has a positive impact on third-party candidates or candidates that are underrepresented and things along those lines.
Right, thank you. And let's see. So, one list of questions here. So which is currently more common in state elections here in the United States, plurality or majority rules for voting?
So it depends on the level, but I'm fairly certain plurality is is a little bit more popular than majority, but it also depends on if you mean like a state elections in like a state treasurer or state house versus a state election that's electing a federal office. But I think typically it seems to be plurality is a little bit more popular.
Thank you. Okay, so what power does a state government have in instituting ranked choice voting? Can it require local municipalities to use this form of voting, or can they only pass legislation to make it an option?
So states can, without a doubt, require localities to institute ranked choice voting. We have this wonderful system of federalism here in the United States, where federal government kind of tells state governments what to do. State governments can tell local governments what to do. And so, for example, if Connecticut passed a law saying all localities must use ranked choice voting, that's within their power to do so. Particularly because within the Constitution, we give states the power to design elections kind of how they see fit. There are some federal guidelines that they have to abide by, but they get a lot of wiggle room in how they want to design their elections. So if they wanted to require all localities use ranked choice voting, they could. They could also just say it's an option. If you want to opt in, you can definitely do that. And we've seen some states do something along those lines.
Great, thank you. And in elections where a municipality uses ranked choice voting, but the state does not, are multiple ballots required for that election?
So it depends on how the ballot is going to be formatted, but typically it's either one ballot where you'd have the state elections that's not ranked choice voting and then ranked choice voting on the same exact ballot, but maybe lower on it or on a different page or something along those lines, or potentially two separate ballots. And all of that gets everything to be a little bit more complicated. If you're a voter and you're just going down the line, like imagine you're voting for federal offices, then state offices, and your local offices via ranked choice voting. If all these other offices are plurality or majority, you might just be filling in dots and going down the line. And you might incorrectly fill in dots for your local RCV elections. So this is when it's incredibly important, again, for local election officials to provide information about how to vote well in advance. That way citizens can see these ballots and understand, okay, after I get past the federal elections and the state elections, once I get to my local elections, I have to switch my mind from this plurality majority system to this RCV system. And in doing so, they can help educate voters so they know how to traverse those ballots. Because ballot design can be very difficult. And even slight changes, as we saw in Florida in 2000, for example, to how ballots are designed can have pretty dramatic effects.
Yeah, very true. Thank you. And here's an interesting question. What would happen if a ranked choice voting election still results in a tie? Or is that even possible?
So it's theoretically possible. My best guess, I've not encountered this in my readings. My best guess is that if it's within a certain margin of error, so to have an absolute tie where like the two leading candidates get exactly like 3,333 votes each or something along those lines, you probably have some runoff or some redo an election like a month later or something along those lines. That's my best guess of exactly how that would unfold, but it's very, very unlikely to have that close of an election. Although in my home state of Iowa, we had a couple elections that were decided by like less than 50 votes in 2018 and 2020, if I remember correctly. So it's not impossible, but it is pretty unlikely.
Great, thank you. And here's another interesting question. Could the federal government ever implement ranked choice voting nationwide? Or is this a decision that can only be made by state governments?
So that is a very good question. Typically, the states have the most power for how they want to design their elections. They're the ones who have the choice to choose how senators and representatives are elected, including federal and state senators and representatives. But there are some limitations. For example, early 2000s, I believe, a couple states tried to institute term limits for federal Congress. However, term limits were decided to be unconstitutional because state governments cannot decide the qualifications for federal offices. However, they can decide how those offices are elected. And so my guess would be that states have the power to decide things like ranked choice voting. The federal government might not have a lot of influence in that area, but I'm not entirely certain there. I'd have to double check on that. But my guess would be that it'd be difficult for the federal government to say everybody must use ranked choice voting.
Right, thank you. We have a couple of very specific questions here. So logistically, what happens when a candidate does not receive 50% or more of the vote on the first vote, and the candidate with the least votes is eliminated? Let me read that again. What happens when a candidate does not receive 50% or more of the vote, 50% or more on the first vote, and the first candidate with the least votes is eliminated? Do ballots with the eliminated candidate as the first choice have to be manually recounted? So votes for the second choice candidate can be counted. Did that make sense?
So I think so. I think there's kind of two questions there, if I understood it correctly. The first is whether or not these votes have to be manually recounted. They don't have to be manually recounted. The minute that you put those into the machine does the algorithm and figures it all out. As far as like what happens, I actually have a pretty good visual to show what happens to these elections when the RCV elections are undergone. If it's okay with you, I'll share my screen one more time and kind of show how that unfolds.
Yeah, of course.
Awesome. Get that set up.
Mm-hmm.
All right, can you see the U.S. Senator election data?
Yes.
Awesome. So I had this on my PowerPoint, but the PowerPoint didn't let me click on the link. So this is the actual results from the ranked choice voting election in Alaska for their U.S. Senator. So here we have the round one votes where you have Lisa, Kelly, Patricia, and Buzz. Lisa and Kelly have about 43%, Patricia 11%, and Buzz 3%. This is at the end of the first round, so everybody's first votes. Now Buzz is the least popular candidate. At the same time, no candidate got 50%. So we go to the second round. Basically, Buzz is eliminated, and everybody who voted for Buzz first, they now have their second place votes. So a lot of people who liked Buzz, they liked Kelly second, some like Lisa second, and a few like Patricia second. So again, at the end of the second round now, we have it to where no candidate has 50% of the vote. Here, Patricia is the least liked candidate, so Patricia is eliminated. So now what happened was everybody who voted for Patricia first, they now go to the second place voters. At the same time, everybody who had Kelly first and Patricia second, they go to the third place voters. This is where it gets kind of complicated once you start eliminating multiple voters. What ended up happening is, so Kelly and Patricia are both eliminated. Those votes ended up going to, Patricia and Buzz were eliminated. Those votes went to Kelly and Lisa, and then Lisa Murkowski ends up winning the election with about 54% of the vote. So that's kind of how these ranked choice voting elections unfold. That answer that question, I hope?
Yeah, I think so. That was a really good visual. Thank you. Okay, where did the questions go? 1 second. All right, so another one. I've heard that ranked choice voting could result in two candidates from the same party competing at the top of the ballot. Is that true? And if so, does that mean that ranked choice voting eliminates primaries?
Yeah, so it's definitely possible that you could have two competing in the final round. And so you have this issue where, for example, you have Party A and Party B. They each field 5 candidates, but 2 candidates from Party A are the most popular. So they're the ones kind of jockeying to get the actual election there at the end. That's very possible. And in fact, some cities have used ranked choice voting to eliminate the need for primary voting in and of itself. But it doesn't necessarily have to eliminate primaries. You can do ranked choice voting with and without primaries. But again, sometimes localities use ranked choice voting to get away from even needing a primary election. Because there are some issues with the way we do primaries here in the United States. For example, we know they have very low turnout. And what tends to be is that people who vote in primary elections tend to be those individuals who have stronger partisan attachments, and they have some significant differences from the general public. And so you might get candidates who the general public doesn't like very much, but those primary voters did like a lot. And so there's kind of a pro and con to both of these sides.
So there could be instant primaries and instant runoffs then with ranked choice voting.
Or you could just do it all at once. If you say you had 5 candidates on party A that wanted to run for office, 5 candidates in party B, and instead of doing a primary and then a general, just throw them all into the general and see what happens.
All right, so another question. How detailed is public reporting on vote totals where ranked choice voting is used? If no candidate wins a majority of the first vote and the election moves to certain voters' second and thirds, are there specific breakdowns of these votes?
So the public availability of this data varies. It's not widely available that you can actually see exactly how all these breakdowns went down, but there is some emerging scholarship that's questioning whether or not combinations of different vote totals can result in voters being identifiable. And so if I say I'm going to vote for candidate A first, candidate C second, so on and third, fourth, I have a specific pattern, there might be some issues where if that becomes public knowledge, you might be able to identify who I am, but that's very difficult. That's still, again, emerging scholarship that we're looking into.
Thank you. So here's an interesting question. Is there data on how many choices voters select on ranked choice voting, or what percentage of voters ranked all the listed candidates?
Yeah, there is some data on this. I did not brush up on it prior to this talk, so I don't remember all the numbers off the top of my head. But we tend to see, if I remember correctly, a good portion of voters rank multiple candidates, but not every voter ranks all candidates. So I think there's like a middle ground of, hypothetically, if 5 candidates are allowed, a good number of voters are going to go 1, 2, and 3, maybe some 4, but not a whole lot of going all 5. And there's some previous literature argued that this was evidence of people not knowing how to use the system, using the system wrong, or things along those lines. We also have to remember that voters are ranking by preference. If there's 5 candidates and I only like 3 of them, I should not be forced to rank all 5. That's like saying, if there's 5 candidates, if these 3, the A, B, or C, if they're in the election, I want them to win. If it's an election between D and E, I don't like D and E, I might not even vote because I don't want to have to vote for the lesser of 2 evils type of thing. So it goes back to this kind of similar system of what is your preferences, listing your preferences. If you don't like them, they're not part of your preferences, so you don't have to list them. And so in that end, we tend to see that people rank, multiple candidates, but maybe not all the candidates.
All right, thank you so much. Again, anybody, if you have any questions to ask Dr. Coll, please do leave them in the chat or in the comments section. Let me see if we have any other new questions. Okay, it doesn't look like we have more questions. One sec. Okay, here's an odd one. Maybe there's not an answer to this question, but is there any way to tell whether ranked choice voting could have changed the outcome of past elections?
So it would be very difficult. You would need data on how everybody who voted, what their second, third, fourth, and so on choices would have been. The best way I can think of off the top of my head right now on the spot would be to ask voters, like say you had an election for senator there in Connecticut and the election was in 2022 and you didn't use ranked choice voting. You could then survey voters and say, okay, these were the candidates that were on the ballot. Who would you have voted for in a ranked choice voting ballot, and see that way? But as far as I'm aware, without the data that doesn't exist, you can't really analyze that very well.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good question, though. Interesting.
Yeah, interesting question. Yeah, all right. Well, Dr. Coll, that is the end of my questions. If nobody else has any questions to post on the comments or in the chat, is there anything else that you would like to add before we wrap things up?
I would just add that back to that idea of, I mentioned earlier of like states and localities as laboratories of democracy. You get this opportunity to experiment with solutions to old problems. And whether it's ranked choice voting or something else, I think it's important that states and localities take that responsibility pretty seriously and consider, looking at alternatives to what they've been doing for years to see if they can find solutions to the problems that we have. No election system is perfect. No election system will ever be perfect, but some election systems have more flaws than others. And so whether it's ranked choice voting you want to try, proportional representation, or anything along those lines, I think it's important that when debating whether or not you want to try these things, look into the literature and see what are those effects and understand if those changes are right for your specific locality. Elections aren't a one size fits all. You might need, well, one city might think ranked choice voting is just the bee's knees. Another city might absolutely hate it. So it's important to understand that when you're debating these changes.
Hey, thank you so much. So that's just the great experiment that is democracy, right?
Exactly.
Again, democracy is a living system. There's always going to be changes because that's just the way society works. People change and laws have to change as well. All right. So thank you very much, Dr. Coll, and everybody joining us today for this really important discussion about this very important current topic and current debate that is taking place all over the country, not just here in Connecticut. But yeah, thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Coll, and everybody for joining us. Do check out our survey, which you will see at the very end of the description, the video description. We would like to hear your feedback and let us know how we did and what other subjects you would like us to cover in future programs. So again, thank you so much for being with us today, Joseph, and everybody have a wonderful day, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Mm-hmm.